It's an established fact that lightsabers are awesome. Humans have dreamt up many different sorts of cool weapons, real and fictional alike, but there's nothing quite as awe-inspiring or elegant as a meter-long blade of pure energy. In the Star Wars universe, lightsabers were not only incredibly cool, but incredibly versatile as well. They could deflect incoming projectiles and energy bolts, melt through just about anything, and of course, they could be used in lightsaber on lightsaber combat. But could they have been even more versatile? Some fans have pointed out that lightsabers have another attribute that, for some reason, their users rarely made use of: the power button. Surely being able to turn your blade off and on would be useful in combat. Well, as it would turn out, it's a bit more complicated than that. But don't get your neck beat in a twist. We're going to be explaining it all in this video.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
What is it? It's your father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight. Not as clumsy or random as a blast.
As you might expect, lightsaber combat evolved from more traditional swordsmanship styles. Before the invention of lightsabers, the ancient Jedi expertly crafted steel swords imbued with the Force. They developed many fighting techniques, and after the invention of the proto-saber, they began adapting their techniques to suit the new weapon. The techniques developed for the proto-saber were, in turn, adapted for the lightsaber when those were invented, and several new techniques were developed for lightsabers specifically. Even though lightsaber combat had its roots in swordsmanship, they were distinct for a few reasons, with the most important being that lightsabers were not swords and couldn't necessarily be used in the same way. Lightsaber blades were considerably different from actual blades. They were actual energy loops, part of a closed circuit. When activated, a beam of plasma would extend out about a meter and then loop back into the hilt, feeding energy back into the saber's power cells, from which the energy was projected back out into the blade. This circuit, or arc, was regulated by a user-controlled containment field which determined the length of the blade. The arc of a lightsaber blade had a subtle gyroscopic effect which could make lightsabers difficult to use, especially since all the weight was in the hilt. Untrained lightsaber users were often disoriented by these factors, which made the weapon's balance and shifts in motion surprisingly difficult to master. Another tricky thing about lightsabers was the manner in which they cut. The gyroscopic force of the blade arc had a subtle repulsing effect on solid objects, and contrary to popular belief, it was actually this effect that allowed sabers to cut through things. Lightsaber blades themselves didn't generate any heat, rather, the gyroscopic force they generated did. This meant that, for a lightsaber to actually cut through something, the user needed to put some serious momentum behind the blade. If they didn't, then the gyroscopic force of the blade would work against the lightsaber, causing it to bounce off its target. Don't believe us? Here's a clip from Return of the Jedi. Pay attention to Luke's lightsaber as it hits the railings. This repulsing effect, by the way, was why lightsaber blades clashed instead of passing through each other. Now that we have a better understanding of how lightsabers worked, we can move on to our main topic: why saber users didn't toggle their sabers on and off to get through their opponent's guard. The simple answer to this question is, well, they did. The technique was called the Tràkata, and it was invented by a Jedi consular in the days of the Old Republic, after lightsaber technology became reliable enough that the technique wasn't dangerous. On the surface, Tràkata was pretty simple. The lightsaber user would rapidly toggle their weapon on and off, confusing their opponent and allowing for diversionary feints. This technique was often used in tandem with Jar Kai, a technique that involved the use of dual blades. There are a few common moves within Tràkata. The most well-known was known colloquially as Pass the Blade, which was when a duelist deactivated their saber to avoid an opponent's block and then reignited the blade into their opponent's chest. A simpler move was Unbalancing Block, which was when a duelist caught their opponent's blade with a block and then deactivated their saber, leaving their opponent to stumble forward and become vulnerable. The third move, and the trickiest, was Flash Slash, which was when a duelist activated their weapon and then deactivated it once the blade reached full length. Use of the Tràkata required concentration and extreme precision, the sort only Jedi and Sith were capable of. Philosophically speaking, it was very different from most other Jedi or Sith combat techniques, as it was a deceptive tactic. The Jedi usually avoided combat techniques that relied on deception, as Jedi doctrine prized honesty and straightforwardness, even with one's enemies. At the same time, while the Sith were big fans of deception, they weren't really into the practicality of the technique. Their power came from passion, which didn't lend itself well to things like precision. However, Tràkata was still used by both Jedi and Sith, so the philosophical incongruence of the technique was apparently excusable to both sides. For both the Jedi and the Sith, Tràkata saw the most use during the Sith Wars, proving highly useful against large groups of enemies and force users of enemy sects. As you might expect, the technique became more popular as lightsaber duels became more common. However, after the end of the new Sith Wars, Tràkata fell out of style. By the time of the Clone Wars, when Jedi next to never encountered lightsaber-wielding enemies, it was rarely taught and almost never used. On face value, Tràkata might sound like a simple, easy way to win a lightsaber duel. It was, however, neither simple nor easy, in large part because of the lightsaber mechanics we talked about earlier. The gyroscopic force of the blade arc was tricky to control, but it was considerably more tricky when you were constantly altering the blade, and therefore the force. Lightsabers required momentum to be effective, but it's hard to maintain the momentum of an object that feels like it's getting lighter and then heavier again. Tràkata required special training to execute properly, otherwise attempting it would disorient and potentially kill the user, not their opponent. Tràkata required extraordinary amounts of precision to the point where even skilled Jedi struggled to make it work. If a duelist made a Tràkata move too quickly, they would miss their target and leave themselves open to attack. If they made a Tràkata move too slowly, their opponent could easily make their own move while the duelist's guard was down. Remember, lightsabers weren't purely offensive weapons. Jedi and Sith relied on them for defense as well. Shutting off your lightsaber leaves you open to attacks, which means you'd have to be damn sure you're going to succeed if you're going to turn off your blade in the middle of a fight. After all, shutting off your lightsaber doesn't just allow you to bypass your opponent's guard, it allows your opponent to bypass yours. This was a large part of why Tràkata fell out of style after the end of the new Sith Wars, and why it was never really that popular to begin with. It was tricky to pull off, and in many cases, that difficulty meant it wasn't worth it. Most Jedi preferred to rely on their trademark patience and skill, while most Sith would prefer to rely on their trademark battle fury. Furthermore, after the Sith were seemingly wiped out, Tràkata became somewhat pointless. Like Makashi, a lightsaber form specifically intended for lightsaber dueling, it became a rarity due to the simple fact that there weren't any Sith to have lightsaber duels with anymore. By the time of the Clone Wars, the form had virtually died out, and next to no Jedi were trained in it. However, Tràkata did make a bit of a comeback in Legends. Numerous members of the New Jedi Order made use of it in the post-Endor era, most notably Mara Jade Skywalker. So as it turns out, there are actually downsides to just shutting off your weapon in the middle of a battle. But what do you think? If you were a Jedi, would you like to learn Tràkata, or do you think it would be a waste of time? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.